Coming all the way over from England. Thank you so much for this opportunity to sit and think and talk and bathe in Miller. It's wonderful. And Bill, James, thank you so much for encouraging us across the Atlantic. This session will be a session that allows us to think through the way that Miller's writing and his visual practice intersect. So hopefully we should have a lot of fun. You should be able to enjoy some pictures. And I will introduce you to my wonderful colleague Caroline. So Caroline Belinda's first book was a self-made surrealist ideology and aesthetics in the work of Henry Miller. So that was 2000, Camden House. She's published extensively on phototext intersections and is the editor of new critical essays on James Agee and Walker Evans' perspectives on Let Us Now Praise Famous Men and United States topographics in national landscapes. In addition, Caroline has published widely on transatlantic modernism, the work of European photographers, and Caroline's last book, The American Phototext, a critical survey of documentary studies, examines various collaborations between writers and photographers in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Her interest in the intersections between photography and writing all goes back to Miller's friendship with Brassai and their nocturnal Parisian perambulations. And at the moment, Caroline's working on a forthcoming edition of critical essays on the American photographer Robert Frank. So, without further ado.
Well, 20 minutes, not that much time, so I feel the pressure. But I want to, actually, I think I want to start with the comment or quote that was given by Arthur Hoyle, which was Miller saying, that he wants nothing to do with the creaking machinery of humanity. We know that's a lie, really, as are many lies that make his writing paradoxical, contradictory, and very wonderful. And I want to talk about some of these contradictions, I think. But taking as my starting point a publication that isn't very known, which is actually Henry Miller's little introduction to his friend, the photographer Brassai's book of strange sort of prose poems from 49 called Histoire de Marie, which was a series of sort of short statements by the fictitious Marie, who works as a cleaning woman in Paris and who lives a very impoverished, very sad life, but nonetheless gets by, and I'll show you some extracts from that. Miller's introduction is extraordinary because, first of all, he's talking about somebody that he, of course, wrote about both before this point in time and also afterwards, which is Brassai, and whose visual practice he was very interested in. And for me, at least, his most interesting piece on photography is an essay that many will be familiar with, which is The Eye of Paris. But this is something slightly off-center. For one thing, it's Brassai doing an unusual thing, which is produce a piece of fiction or a collection of poems, whatever you want to call them. And it signals, if you will, the intersection, the kind of intermedial landscape that they were occupying from the point in time where they met each other in the 1930s and onwards. And this is kind of what interests me, going back to this statement about the creaking machinery of humanity, is that really for me the most democratic impulse in Miller, oddly enough, is not his statements about democracy, and it's not his statements about what it means to be un-American or be un-American, but it actually comes through in his extraordinary interest in the practice of other artists who kind of mess about, if you will, with the ideas of identification, the confessional voice, what it means to be a narrator of lives lived on the street from a working class perspective. So whether this is going to come out in other papers, I'll be curious to see. But I did want to bring in the issue, and that I feel is topical and is certainly relevant to what's going on today, the issue of how class as a socio-economic thing plays into the work of Miller. I do think that we sometimes forget, because of the kind of persuasive nature of the general palaver about individualism and what it means to be self-sufficient, we tend to forget that these are also very strong and very crucial representations of what it means to be poor, right? It may be about survival in the end, but it's also about, how shall we put it, having a very attentive eye to the working people. And in this case, Marie becomes a kind of version of this that he then complements, if you will, through his introduction to Brassai's book. But let me move on. Now, again, you will also, some of you, be familiar with his kind of collaboration with Brassai, in that Brassai, of course, supplied the photographs for the most wonderful edition of Quiet Days in Cliché. Hard to come by now, but nonetheless, here are some versions of it. I want to just step back for a moment and think a little bit about the lineage of the kind of phototextual stuff that's going on in that book. You'll see to the left here the one of Brassai's images in that book, which is a direct reference, I think very clearly, to another photographer some of you may be familiar with, who is famous for being the kind of visual text for this idea of Paris as the dream capital of modernity, and of course is Eugène Auger, who did these wonderful photographs that turn up amongst many other places in surrealist publications throughout the 1930s. So there's something going on there that lends itself to thinking about the visualization of modernity on the streets of Paris, how that, and many people have written interestingly about this, how that kind of renders the sense of the city in as a transformative place, but also as a place in the process of being transformed into something visibly different from the 19th century. So lots to be said here about the focus on women's undergarments, but I won't go there. I'm sure other people can run with that if they want to. But Henry Miller, who was friends with the writer and poet Robert Desnos, who had written very famously on Eugène Auger, I would claim is hyper familiar with all this writing about photography. And he's absolutely hyper familiar, I think, with what writing on photography says about the visualization of the person on the street, the working person of Paris. So he's inserting himself by writing on Brassai into a much longer lineage of sort of observational writing, but also into a longer lineage of writing where photography plays a really central role in how we think about modernity on a much wider level. And there's many ways that you can kind of come into this, of course. One of them would be, for instance, through Walter Benjamin's very famous piece about the visualization through photography as part of this kind of counter history of modernity, right? So modernism is, as we think of it, often the many famous writers. Mary Dearborn's great opus of biographies would be a great example of this. We've got Hemingway, we have all the sort of usual incredible figures, but as Walter Benjamin would have it, there is a counter history to modernity that isn't simply about the great writers, but is also about the attentive look that we should apply to the people who are, quote unquote, not important, who seem to be around us everywhere, but who emerge as these extraordinary beings through the lens of the artist. And this seems to me to be the one thing, if you had to sort of put a focus on it, that Miller is most obsessed with in his writing on Brassai. It's this idea that Brassai has an acute eye for the person on the street that is everywhere, but at the same time nowhere because we do not notice them. In Histoire de Marie, to come back to my sort of starting point, and it's difficult to kind of say exactly whether we should read them as kind of poems or little pieces of prose. Brassai imagines himself, puts himself into the kind of headspace of this cleaning woman named Marie. And in one of the first pieces, just to give you a little sort of sense of the tenor, the sound of this, she complains about her name. And she says, I didn't like my name, I'm pretty capable, I know how to get by in life, so why do people call me Mallarmé? Something about it bothered me. Well, I often said to myself, what a load of nonsense. Mallarmé, a name like any other, how stupid of me to hate that name. Then one day a man said to me, Marie, you have a very beautiful name, the name of a great poet. Since then, I've loved my name. There are Dupont, Petit, Legrand, but a name like mine doesn't come along every day. Mademoiselle Marie Mallarmé, right? Okay, so the reader of this will, of course, in many instances, have the actual Mallarmé in their mind, the great simplest French poet, whose name is not quite spelled this way, but nonetheless, there is a kinship being drawn, and you can call this maybe a rather unsophisticated move by Brassai, but nonetheless, it is the kinship between the voice of the woman on the street, who nobody notices, and the great simplest poet who has an attentive lyrical sense of what the city really is about. This is the kind of landscape that Miller very much, I think, also wants to occupy, that we need to remember. And I won't go into this too much today, although there's a great deal to be said of it, it also unseats, I think, some of the kind of stereotypes that a lot of people have about Miller as this kind of hyper-virile masculinist voice. Because it is very interesting, at least to me, that Brassai, in one of his very few pieces of sort of prose poems, decides to embody the voice of a woman, right, as opposed to a man on the streets of Paris. Now, modernism is replete with instances like this. The most famous one is probably Joyce doing Molly Bloom in Ulysses, right? That's the one that's always taught, at least at university. But we should also, again, perhaps think back to how there is an attempt, it seems to me, even in the most, shall we say, overtly obscene, overtly perhaps sexualized, aggressive moments in Henry Miller to attain the body of the female object, there's also always this kind of slippage into a strange desire to become the thing that you want to obtain. So I think there's something really interesting going on there in terms of not just this kind of alignment with somebody who is very much written as working class, but also with somebody who is, in fact, the opposite gender of oneself. And if anybody actually knows of anybody who has written on Brassai's work in this book, then I would love to know, but I don't think there is anything. Here we have this very, very famous shot, right, by Brassai of people in the cafe. For me, what makes this such a beautiful shot is to do with the kind of reflections in the mirrors. And Brassai, as with so many other street photographers in the 1930s, is absolutely obsessed with the idea of the urban as being a space that has reflective surfaces. There's lots to be said about how that fits into the technology of photography, which is in some instances about duplication. But here, the content of the photograph itself is, of course, also playing around with the idea of duplication. We see the woman's ecstatic face, but we also see the face of her partner because it's reflected in the mirror. So again, it seemed to me that there's something in the content of this image which operates as a very beautiful metaphor for some of the things that both Miller and Brassai are trying to do in their practice. I don't know what to call this, so for lack of a better phrase, I put down a reflective aesthetic here. Here's a little snippet of Miller in the actual introduction to Histoire de Marie, the things that happened to her, her reactions, her reflections, even her language. We know them intimately and recognize them as if Marie were what she really is, a part of ourselves. So throughout the whole thing, he's intent on this kind of alignment. It's not about the male artist observing the poor woman on the street or the prostitute on the corner, whatever it might be. It's about somehow, through mutual recognition of what it means to be alive, to suffer, to be in pain, to work, to not have money, feel that you are actually not at all dissimilar to the thing you're describing. So to go back to my point about what is the democratic impulse in Miller, to me, I guess that is what it is. So who owns the city in this regard is a big question, right? Who perambulates it, who walks around it, who shares it? I wanted to go back to his friend, Miller's friend Desno's obituary for Eugène Auger, which he wrote in Le Sœur, 1928. Did Miller read this? I think it's very likely, where he makes a very iconic, beautiful statement. And he says, following the death of Auger the photographer. The city dies, its ashes are scattered, but the dream capital created by Auger raises its inconquerable ramparts under a gelatin sky, which would make a good title for a book, but I put my finger on that, okay? So don't go there. The maze of streets pursues its course like a river, and the crossroads serve always for pathetic rendezvous. You can hear Miller is reading this stuff. I should have read it in French, but I didn't. So this is interesting. Now again, from the introduction to Histoire de Marie, you who mock poor defenseless Marie, or pity her, who rage at her helplessness, or condemn the injustice that befalls her, what would you look like if your portrait were painted by this? And then he calls the writing of Brassai the candid camera, right? And I think what he's saying is that we should all be so lucky to be one of the objects or subjects, or whatever you want to call it, in a photograph by Brassai. Now, other ways to come and think about this idea of the democratizing impulse or the representation of people on the streets of Paris. One of my favorite theoreticians, Jacques Rancière, who talks very, very smartly about photography and about, actually James Agee, that's how I got into him. He coins this term, the anonymous multiple, as the kind of a version of like the everyman on the street, right? And he says, how do we think about this? It's when the ordinary becomes a trace of the true if it is torn from its obviousness in order to become a hieroglyph, a mythological or phantasmagoric figure. Now, the idea of the phantasmagoric, right, is such a sort of Miller phrase, isn't it? It's this idea that we are all wondrously constituted. We are all possibly one of the subjects in a photograph by Brassai, but it is about looking attentively and then removing that person from their kind of constituent, ordinary, everyday space. Again, Rancière says, this is a transformation of the visible and sensible into a space for the appearance of a subject, the people, the workers, the citizens, right? And this brings me back to the idea that I feel there is a genuinely sort of democratizing impulse in Miller that it's worth keeping an eye on. Sometimes it disappears in something that is slightly vitriolic, that is perhaps somehow blanketed by this kind of machismo, it seems to me, but it is very often there. Another writer who terms, I think, a good phrase for what's going on here is somebody that Miller would also have been aware of, a great photographer from the 30s and 40s, Louis Stettner, who was a part of the Photo League, which some people might know about. He talked about how these images were there to give a voice, to give agency in ways intimated but not possible through the photograph, which for me, and so this is me saying that for me this is, like for Rancière, a political act, but it is still reliant on a very aesthetic dimension, right? Because of course, as you saw in that photograph of the lovers in the cafe, yes, it might give the appearance of being, ooh, he just saw those people in the corner and he thought, I'm going to take that shot. But of course, it's very aestheticized with the mirrors and the way that it's set up and so forth and so on. So the two things cannot be divorced, in other words. I can't believe I'm still on green. I might just start walking around a bit. Are you being attentive?
Yeah, you're 18 minutes. Yeah,
I'm good, okay. Here's another beautiful photograph from Quiet Days in Cliché. I don't think this is entirely, I have a strong feeling that Brassai said to these attractive young people, would you like to just step outside of the cafe for a minute? So he could do this beautiful shot. But again, here is Miller in the introduction to Histoire de Marie. I apologize a bit, it's not translated, so this is me trying to produce something that sounds okay, just so don't hold me to this, right? I sincerely hope, he says, that to this faithful and spontaneous recital of the cleaning woman, Brassai will add others, that of the bus driver, the prostitute, the pawnbroker, the journalist, the politician, the criminal, and so on. across all strata of society, what a moving document such a series would make. Perhaps we would see ourselves in a new light. Perhaps we would see how similar we really are. If we could all speak as individuals, reflect our own vision of the universe, our daily tasks, however limited and distorted. After all, is the artist much wiser than the barber or the carpenter, right? So this is overtly, I mean, in fact, it doesn't even need that much glossing. It is Miller saying, what if we were all and everybody was us, right? This, to me, is what democracy is about. And he's saying this, I think is worth remembering, in relation to a piece of prose writing by a photographer, a close friend of his, pretending to be a woman who does an awful lot of hard physical labor. So there's an alignment being done here as well, which kind of interests me, between the manual worker and the photographer and the writer. And of course, there's lots to be said, I don't want to get into all of this, about the bizarre alignments between the figure of the prostitute, which Brassai is very famous for photographing, and that of the writer. They both carry the means of their labor corporeally, physically, within themselves, and can take it wherever they go and produce something more or less wherever they go, right? And I don't think he's completely oblivious to this, to be absolutely honest. Other comments on Brassai that are interesting in this respect: later on, by the time Brassai has really been discovered, has become an icon of sort of urban French street photography, has had numerous one-man shows at New York. The famous curator of MoMA, John Sarkovsky, writes, and this is regarding Brassai, his sensibility dates from an earlier age and delights in the primal, the fantastic, the ambiguous, even the bizarre. Yet the most distinguishing characteristic of Brassai's work is its profound poise and naturalness, its sense of easy permanence. And I really like that phrase, the sense of easy, I'm on red now, the sense of easy permanence, right? Looking at the pictures, one is not aware of the act of photography. So it's this kind of semblance of realism, despite it being a highly aestheticized thing. Let me just get to, there we have famous shots from Paris de Nuit, and much more stuff. I mean, these are very available, all these images, so you guys can easily find it, right? The stuff on. So I'll finish with this one slide, going back to this idea that there was something, I think, for Miller in photography that aided him in formulating this democratizing principle. For me, there's a fine line between this idea of taking agency, speaking through someone else's voice, which is what happens in Marie, and the kind of letting go, if you will, temporarily of your role as an observer, which is quite astonishing that Brassai did that in his writing. And then I also think there's much to be said about Miller's admiration for the photographic eye, which interestingly counters this kind of focus that many people aim or use when dealing with Miller's writing, namely the kind of confessional voice, but the way that photography both makes the position of the artist very palpable, but also somehow allows it to disappear into the subject matter at the same time. And I think that is a tremendous accomplishment. And then, as I was saying, this concerted, deliberate attempt to render the voice of another class, of another gender, that this is all part of the artistic prerogative, I think is also something that we need to consider as Miller's grand project. And I'll stop there.